Hey there, it's Laura Dominic. Thanks for joining me on a Plan for Joy podcast. Each week we'll be talking about things that will help you break the cycle of depletion. You know, the one that has you going from doing all the things to feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, resentment, anger, to sucking it up and starting all over again. And instead, learn to break the cycle and contribute from a place of abundance. Are you ready? Good. Let's go. Hello, and welcome back to a Plan for Joy podcast. If you missed episode 1, I just want you to know that this is a continuation of that, so you might want to go back and listen to that first episode entitled Welcome to My Early Years. If you were here for that episode, then you know today that I'm going to be picking up at a time when I learned the hard lesson of never saying never. When I got married, I was very specific about what I wanted. I wanted 2 kids. I wanted to live in the big city. I wanted a career that was going to make me happy. And I'm really not sure that my husband felt the same way. But at that point, it didn't really matter too much to me. This is what I wanted. He just needed to follow along. And so my husband and I had a weird thing where we had a lot of 7s in our life. And this is important. You'll see why in a few minutes. Both of our birthdays were on the 7th of different months. We had started dating on the 7th of March. We got engaged on the 7th of February, and then, of course, we got to choose this, but we got married on the 7th of May. And so one day, before we were married, we were at his house, and his sister was there. You know, we had been going through this for whatever reason that day, and she had jokingly asked, "Oh, so are you going to have 7 kids?" At which point, I literally laughed in her face and said, "I will never have 7 kids," and then promptly forgot about that conversation. So we got married, and after several years of struggling with fertility, we had our first daughter. We went along, because I wanted 2 kids, so we went along, and we had our second daughter. After she was born, she was about 6 months old. That year, I went out Christmas shopping with remember my BFF that I met when I was 4 years old in the old neighborhood. So we were still in contact with each other. We went out for dinner and Christmas shopping when my second daughter was 6 months old. And we were at dinner, and I told her about something that had happened to me the week before that I wasn't sure about. A couple weeks prior to that, I had signed up. We were at church, and I had signed up for something called 40 Hours Devotion. And I had absolutely no idea what it was. I don't even know, or at the time I didn't know what it was that made me even sign up for it. But I thought, oh, well, that sounds like a fine thing to do for an hour. So when I got to the church for my time, I picked up a book because I thought, well, I got to do something while I'm sitting here for an hour. And I picked up the first book that I came across, and it was a book on an examination of conscience. At that point, I didn't even really know what that was, but I picked it up and I sat down and read it. And boy, did I feel, I don't know what the right word is, offended, assaulted, upset, whatever, confused, definitely, by the time I left there at that hour, because everything I was reading in this examination of conscience, I didn't agree with. So I was a little confused by that. So, I went to dinner with my friend and I said, what's going on with the church? I don't agree with most of the things that I guess I'm supposed to agree with. So in our, 45 minutes of eating dinner, she tried to explain the faith to me. And so okay, that sounds reasonable. I shrugged my shoulders and I carried on. We went and finished our shopping. And then on the way home that evening, I was in the car by myself, and I can tell you exactly where I was, on which highway, at which mile marker, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Holy Spirit totally filled me with knowledge that everything I had read in the examination, everything we had talked about at dinner that night was totally true, and I completely accepted it in the span of about 2 seconds. It was truly a miracle. And when I kind of came to an awareness of where I was again, because I was driving, so I realized the song that was playing on the radio was a song called I Can See Clearly Now, The Rain Has Come by Johnny Nash. So I thought, okay, even then, God has such a sense of humor. And so I drove home the rest of the way just sobbing tears of joy, I guess. Now I can look back and say that's what it was. But imagine from my husband's perspective, he was home watching our 2 little girls, and I come in the door sobbing. So he was immediately like, oh my gosh, what happened to you? Are you okay? Is everything fine? So I'm trying to explain to him that yes, in fact, I'm fine. This is what happened. This is the best I understood what happened, because I had very little knowledge of anything of faith related. And so he tried to understand the best he could. And then we just spent like the next couple of months devouring information, just learning about our faith, learning about what we were supposed to do, what we knew we needed to believe. And it was just a beautiful experience, and quite, again, miraculous that we both were on the same journey at the same time. So one of the things we had to do, and we did so willingly, was become open to life. And so after that, our 3rd daughter was born. Shortly after that, it was time for us to contemplate schooling for our oldest daughter. So the same friend of mine had a daughter, 2 daughters that were a little bit older than my first ones, and she had already started homeschooling. So I had already had conversations with her about homeschooling, and of course I said to her, and I would never be able to homeschool. I don't have the patience. I don't want to do it. All the usual rebuttals you would say when you think about homeschooling. And so literally one day I woke up and I was like, we're going to homeschool. And my husband's like, all right, let's do it. And we didn't look back. In fact, this is our 25th year. We're almost done. I'm ready to retire in May. We needed to meet new homeschooling friends if we were going to do this homeschooling thing. And one of our friends that we met introduced me to home births. And that was an absolute hard no. She told me about it, how beautiful it was, blah, blah, blah. Like, I will never have a baby at home because that is absolutely ridiculous. No way. So shortly after that, we got pregnant again. And I don't know. One morning I woke up and I was like, I think we're going to go with the home birth route. And so we found the doctors, because at that time there were doctors that were actually practicing home birth, and went through and had our 4th daughter at home. About that time, we had started our own business, and it was an excavating business, and so we needed to have outdoor space, office space, and at this point we had 2 more children, our first boy and another girl. And so my dream was always to just live in the city. I needed to be around people and things and stuff like that. And I was, and have said, I was never going to live in the country because I was not a country person. No interest, no way. And when we were talking about how we needed more space and all that, I had an errand to run, and it took me out into a more rural area. And I was like, we need to move. We need to move to the country. My husband was like, okay, let's start looking. And we found a lovely piece of property, and it worked perfectly for us. And it was one of the best places we've ever lived. We had animals. We ran our business out of the house. My husband was home and more available to us. And during that time, out in our in our what we call our growth years, the years where our mindset was just much more open and willing to do things and take chances, we had our 7th child, another boy. So God had the last laugh. I did have 7 children. I do have 7 children. And I tell you, I learned at that point that you just don't want to say never. So I stopped. Again, look at never being kind of a fixed mindset sort of thing. Closing off the possibility to what God might want to do in your life. Fortunately, he was pretty persistent when he showed me what it was we needed to do. So we lived in the country, and we were we look back and we were thriving during that time until the economy crashed. My husband was doing excavating for new construction, and that was the time when the housing market crashed. And so literally one day the phone just stopped ringing. Just stopped. We never heard from anybody ever again. And so over a little bit of time, we had to file bankruptcy. We lost the business. We lost the equipment. We lost our home. The judge was kind enough to let us keep our possessions because he said they, pretty much were worthless, which is something everybody always wants to hear. But it meant we could keep what little we had. So we were able to find a rental home that fit us all in there. And again, God's providence. He was very gracious with us, even during this difficult time. I learned my lesson. I started being more willing to be open to what God wanted. My husband was, I think, always a little more open than I was, and I learned to let him lead too. That was a really big part of our journey at that point. And now we find ourselves in another time of transition. I'm about to finish homeschooling. We're going to be sending our youngest off to college next year. Most of the kids are out of the house. It's a huge time of transition. I'm leaving out a lot of what happened. Some of it gets covered in my book that is out on Amazon right now, When Good Isn't Good Enough. And I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. But we're in a time of transition, or I'm in a time of transition. I knew I had to do something different. I had to become almost like a new person if I was going to survive this transition. I had watched other people I knew who were done homeschooling, and it's almost like an identity crisis. Like, who am I? I am a mother of 7 children, and I homeschool. Well, okay, now I'm a mother of 7 adult children, and I'm not homeschooling, or I won't be very shortly. And so who am I? And so much of my past, and I think this is pretty typical when you're going through a major life transition, so much of your past comes up and you're like, okay, there's a lot of things that I need to change if I'm going to go into this next phase successfully. And maybe your next phase isn't a drastic one. Maybe it's, a totally new work environment, or a new home, or a new child. There's so many things that we need to learn to develop ourselves better in this next phase. And I knew that that's what I had to do because, like I said, I had watched other people I knew go through that and not be sure of who they were or what they were going to do. And I didn't want to flounder. I'm going to go into that in the next episode. So I guess this is going to end up being kind of a 3-parter instead of a 2-parter, because really it's that important. You just really need to see where you've been and figure out what parts of that are good to go forward. And I learned that through coaching. Well, I'll talk about all that next time because it would be too much to get into here. But I wanted you to get an idea of who I am and the experiences I've had and how those things, some of those things, needed to change in order for me to be at peace and have joy in the next season of my life. So hopefully you will join me again in the next episode where we will continue this conversation. And until then, God bless.